Imagine setting off fireworks to impress the neighborhood, only to accidentally set your own backyard on fire. Well, that's kind of what just happened with Russia's latest nuclear test. In an attempt to flex its might and send a big, loud message to the West, Russia lit the fuse on a new round of underground nuclear weapons testing. And the world? Yeah, it noticed. But maybe not in the way Putin hoped. Instead of, "Look how powerful we are," the reaction has been more like, "Wait, what are you doing over there?" Because testing nuclear weapons in 2025 is kind of like showing up to a peace summit with a flamethrower. Technically possible, but incredibly awkward. Now let's rewind a bit. Russia recently announced it had upgraded its nuclear test site in Novaya Zemlya, a cold, remote, snowy island chain in the Arctic that sounds like the setting for a Bond villain's vacation home. Then, satellite images showed activity. Trucks, equipment, freshly dug trenches. Not exactly the subtle vibes you'd expect from a country that claims it totally doesn't want a new arms race. Shortly after, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed it had carried out an experiment involving nuclear test site infrastructure. They didn't say it was a full-scale nuclear detonation, but let's be real. When the Kremlin gets vague, people get nervous. And what was the goal here? Well, officially, it's to ensure the reliability of Russia's nuclear arsenal in case the US withdraws from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Unofficially, it's a not-so-subtle middle finger to NATO, the US, and basically anyone who still remembers what the Cold War felt like. The idea is simple. If we can't scare you with our tanks or our oil pipelines, maybe a mushroom cloud will do the trick. But here's where it backfires, spectacularly. Because instead of looking strong and untouchable, Russia's little nuclear drumroll reminded everyone just how isolated and paranoid it's become. The United Nations wasn't thrilled. Neither was China, which, surprise, isn't super keen on radioactive fallout floating into its airspace. Even allies started shifting uncomfortably in their seats like, "Hey man, we're here for the cheap gas, not World War III." And while Russia framed this as a defensive move, the rest of the world heard, "Hi, we're playing with radioactive toys again. Duck and cover." Meanwhile, Washington responded with some good old-fashioned passive-aggressive diplomacy. US officials reminded everyone that America hasn't tested nukes since the 90s and doesn't plan to, unless someone else starts poking the radioactive bear. So, this whole move? It didn't make Russia look stronger. It made it look desperate, like a kid in class who pulls the fire alarm, not to escape, but just to get attention. Even militarily, analysts are calling this more symbolic than strategic, because modern nuclear arsenals don't need open-air tests anymore. That's what simulations, supercomputers, and underground labs are for. But Putin's government seems to love the classics: parades, propaganda, and yes, a little radioactive drama now and then. And all of this is happening while Russia is already stretched thin. Economically, they're dealing with sanctions that hit harder than a vodka hangover. Militarily, Ukraine is still draining resources faster than they can refill them. So why add global nuclear panic to your to-do list? Some insiders say it's internal messaging, trying to rally patriotic sentiment at home, distract from domestic issues, and remind the world that yes, Russia still has nukes and is willing to show them off. But here's the catch. The whole thing is starting to feel like a bluff. Because when your biggest threat is, "We might resume nuclear testing," and everyone replies with, "Cool, we'll keep watching you dig holes in the Arctic," you've kind of lost the intimidation factor. It's like threatening to punch someone but stopping right before your fist leaves your pocket. Over and over, and the Kremlin knows this. That's why their messaging has been all over the place. One day it's just maintenance, the next day it's a test to ensure deterrence, and the day after that it's totally legal and not aimed at anyone. Wink, wink. Meanwhile, Russian state TV is doing what it does best, playing the greatest hits of Cold War nostalgia, complete with grainy black and white footage of mushroom clouds and dramatic music that sounds like it was ripped straight from a 1980s action movie. But outside that propaganda bubble, the mood's a little less cinematic and a lot more concerned. Because every time Russia does something like this, it forces the rest of the world to recalculate, to ask uncomfortable questions, like, should we be modernizing our own nukes? Should we start testing again, just in case? That's how arms races begin. Not with missiles being fired, but with whispers in back rooms and spreadsheets full of nightmare scenarios. And that's exactly what Russia's nuclear theater is triggering. In Washington, there's been renewed talk about upgrading the U.S. nuclear triad, land-based missiles, submarines, and bombers, just in case Russia's not bluffing. In Europe, NATO is debating whether to reposition more assets closer to Russia's border. You know, just in case this whole testing thing becomes a deployment thing. Even China, which usually prefers to sip its tea quietly in the background, is raising eyebrows. Not because it suddenly loves America, but because if there's one thing China doesn't want, it's nuclear instability just north of its border and west of its investments. And let's not forget the environmental angle, because despite the slick announcements and careful language, nuclear tests, yes, even underground ones, carry risk. Seismic tremors, radiation leaks, contamination of groundwater. And when you're doing this in a frozen wasteland like Novaya Zemlya, you're rolling radioactive dice with a fragile Arctic ecosystem. It's like dropping a glowing rock in your freezer and hoping it never melts. So the question becomes, is this worth it for Russia? Short-term media splash? Sure. Long-term diplomatic fallout? Guaranteed. Even countries that don't exactly wear Team America jerseys are side-eyeing Russia right now, because there's a difference between posturing and poking the nuclear bear. And in an age when most military power is demonstrated through drones, cyber attacks, and precision missiles, this whole "let's show them a mushroom cloud" routine feels less like strategy and more like a midlife crisis. The scary part? It still works. Not because it's smart, but because it reminds everyone that the Cold War's dusty playbook is still sitting on a shelf, ready to be reopened. So, while Russia might be playing checkers with a nuclear pawn, the rest of the world is quietly dusting off their own game boards. Which brings us to... So, in conclusion, Russia's nuclear test wasn't just a flash in the Arctic. It was a strategic firework that fizzled before it impressed. Instead of scaring the world, it exposed how badly Moscow wants to look strong, even if it means risking global anxiety, diplomatic blowback, and maybe even a radioactive oopsie. Putin might have thought he was flexing, but to the rest of the world it looked more like someone lighting a match in a room full of gas fumes, just to prove they still had one. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.